Attention all members of the Dark Waters family. I'm proud to announce to you guys that the Dark Waters channel t-shirts are now for sale. Many of you have asked me before, hey Dark Waters, why don't you have a Patreon account, or why don't you do Super Chat? That's because I believe in earning my profits. I don't believe in taking any donations or taking any gifts. So if you really want to support me and the Dark Waters channel and the effort that I'm putting forward, the best way to do so is to buy the t-shirts and the products that will be rolling out over the next couple of months. I'm very excited about the products that are going to be hitting the market. Get your Dark Waters t-shirt today. While supplies last, it's only $25. That includes shipping and handling. The truth is out there.
It is one of the world's greatest mysteries, Scotland's legendary Loch Ness Monster. So does the lake creature actually exist? Well, if you ask one man, he'll tell you it is in fact no myth.
Every day is flaunted in front of your face.
Hundreds of people in the valley say they are hearing voices in their heads.
You just choose to ignore it.
Belief can be a powerful force. No one knows that better than the people who are sure they've seen Bigfoot.
Real accounts.
He says he knows who's playing mind games.
Rogue government officials that are sponsoring this, also corrupt business officials, and private citizens.
From real people.
Hundreds of people turned out tonight for the unveiling of a very controversial statue.
Yeah, it really is. The Satanic Temple of Detroit revealed the 1-ton bronze statue.
It's time for you to take a swim.
I'm just excited to see my Lord and Savior Baphomet represented in such glorious Italian stone. I do hope his eyes gaze upon me and that my allegiance is recognized.
In the Dark Waters.
The Dark Waters channel is for entertainment purposes only. Although information in these stories can be traced back to relevant and true sources, Dark Waters strongly discourages its viewers, listeners, and subscribers from visiting the site of incidents and encounters discussed or revealed on the show. In other words, we will not be held responsible if you are attacked by a Dogman, molested by a Bigfoot, bitten by vampires, chased by chupacabras, abducted by aliens, accosted by the Men in Black, investigated or arrested by the local law enforcement, CIA, FBI, NSA, EPA, BLM, or another alphabet group, whether on U.S. soil or abroad. Thank you for tuning in, and enjoy the show.
Long before we visited Ruby, Alaska, before the death, the blood, the stinging pain of loss, before it was revealed to us that the world was full of hideous monsters, and that the elites of the world knew of these creatures and used them to suit their needs, before we met Vital, Ben, and Chef, it was just Steve and I, two men who traveled the world, searching for a good time, aimlessly wandering without a purpose, having the time of our lives. So tonight, I take you back to the beginning. How it all started, when we first realized that the world is not what it seemed, and walk you through the events that turned us into what we are today, monster hunters. Hours, May 1st, 2004. Steve and I are in Belize, having the time of our lives. Oceanfront resorts, great food, beautiful women. If you've never been to Belize, you need to put it on your bucket list. And the women, oh my God, amazing. With skin tones ranging from the Creole colors of New Orleans to the smooth, dark chocolate of South Africa. In those days, long before we learned about the evils of the world, Rodger and I only cared about traveling. And I'll never forget that night. I was beachside with the most angelic being God ever created. What was her name again? Oh, yes. Alicia. How could I ever forget her? She had these eyes that peered into your soul. You know, if things had gone differently, I could have seen myself marrying a woman like her. Beautiful, intelligent, and from a family of means. Alicia. Yeah. Rodger was a few feet down from me, drinking and entertaining a group of 3 women, running his usual mind control language patterns, talking about feelings and using words like imagine this and and presupposing that all three of them will be having sex tonight when his satellite phone rang. You know, sometimes I wish that he had never answered that phone call. I sit back and wonder how our lives would have been if he had just taken those women back to his room instead of taking that call. It was that very phone call that set us on the path to becoming monster hunters. The phone call was from a man named Sorkin. You see, Sorkin had his eyes on this gold-rich land outside of San Carlos, Venezuela. Locals there were pan-mining the area and selling lots of gold. And as for Sorkin, best way to describe him is a globalist. He had his hands in everything: drugs, guns, prostitution, diamonds, gold mines, oil. You name it, he had access to it. Countries didn't matter to him. In fact, borders didn't exist to him. And rules? Shit on rules. They didn't even apply to Sorkin. One day he told me Hugo Chavez was just a pissant dictator to him. You see, I'd only met him once before. Rodger and I got an invite to hang out with him and his sons at their box suite at the Dallas Cowboy games. And I had never seen anything like this in my life. I mean, the power this guy had. Congressmen, diplomats, foreign ambassadors. Everywhere we went, somebody was kissing his ring. And somehow, Sorkin and Rodger's dad were good friends. But looking back on everything, I don't even know how he fucking knew we were in Belize. From within 24 hours of that phone call, we go from drinking and partying to doing business. Sorkin's business. He makes us an offer, and a good one at that. Just for reaching the location and securing it, we would get 3% equity in the mines. Now, of course, with a man like Sorkin, 3% really means 2% or 1%, but we really didn't give a damn. It was an adventure, and we were adventurers. The following morning, Steve and I caught a flight from Belize to Caracas. Then, shit got a little shaky. We boarded an old 1981 Cessna plane for the most dangerous flying I have ever experienced in my life, hopping from city to city, from Caracas to San Fernando. And when we landed in San Fernando to get fuel, we damn near lost a wheel on the plane. Potholes all over the runway. After fixing the wheel and several other close calls, we landed in San Carlos-de Negro. Now, not to be confused with San Carlos. San Carlos-de Negro is a small city. It rests right upon the Rio Negro River. And the guy that Sorkin had put us in contact with in the area was named Juan. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that Juan did, but I can tell you this much. San Carlos-de Negro is on the border of Venezuela and Colombia. This guy does business with Sorkin and spends a lot of time in the jungles. Catch my drift? As far as San Carlos-de Negros, the color of the city is a bit of an overstatement. This place was bare bones. A village is more like what I would call it. Stray dogs everywhere, poverty like nothing I'd ever seen. We jump in the back of the Jeep with Juan and his right-hand man, Dante. Now, Juan really was nothing special to look at. Small man, weighed no more than 185 pounds and stood about 5'10". But Dantes, his boy, looked like he had been through a rough life. He's about 6'3", very slim, but he had the eyes of a killer. You know those cold, dead eyes? Soulless? And his head must have been split open like a melon at some point in time, because the scars on his face and the stitch job, man, imagine a skinny Latin version of Frankenstein with tattoos. And what was even more disturbing about Dantes was he didn't say a word the entire time. He was just there. We drove for what seemed like about an hour through the jungles. And then we arrived at this clearing. Had these fancy huts. Juan's operation was something major. Talking about 200 people in the middle of the jungle, moving around like work ants. Men, women, and children. We were set up in our own hut. 2 beds, table, chair. It was actually pretty nice. I lay down for a minute to take a nap, and Juan and Rodger disappeared and went off somewhere. When I finally awoke, it was sundown, and a fire pit started everywhere. Rodger was sitting there with Juan and Dantes, laughing and joking. Back in those days, he was way more charismatic, far from this obsessed personality that he has today. That's why they laid out the plans. We were to get up at first light, and Rodger and Juan were going to fly over to Colombia to get supplies. Dantes and I were to take one of the large jeeps, 6 men, and head out to the area where locals were mining the gold. We would leave those 6 men there overnight to build huts and make preparations for us to arrive the next day. We spent the rest of the night sitting there drinking, laughing, and joking. And then the following morning, Rodger and I parted ways, and I was left there to deal with Dantes. Turns out he was way more talkative than I would ever imagine. In fact, this dude talked the entire ride as we slowly maneuvered our way down this half-washed out road headed to the location. He talked about his family, how his mother and father were murdered in a drug war with the Colombians. He bragged about being shot 10 times like he was Tupac and not dying. He told me about when he was hit in the head with a machete and how some of the workers rebelled against him and Juan. This man had been dealt some major shit in his lifetime, and he was only 32 years old. Now, I don't know if any of you guys ever spent time in the jungles. It's different from the woods of North America. It's hot, humid, the air is thin, and every breath is a struggle. You find yourself sweating profusely. And soon, I was taking off my shirt just like Dante's. Riding in the Jeep was the only positive thing about this trip. Just a little air circulating to cool me down. It was like having your own personal spot in hell. It was just that hot. And Dante's continued to surprise me. I didn't realize he was a hands-on kind of guy. When we hopped out of the Jeep, he grabs a chainsaw and begins to help clear the trees with the other guys. And within the first 3 hours, they had the first structure completely built. It was crude at first. Pretty much a small log structure, but they claimed by tomorrow, it would have a tile roof to protect us from the rains. This was something I had to see. While they worked, I ventured off a little to explore, carrying an AK-47 that Dante's gave me. It gave me a stern warning about the jaguars, telling me to keep my eyes up on the trees if I wanted to live. And then he told me to follow the sounds of the waterfall, and eventually I would find what gold was being mined by the people of the villages. After traveling about 300 feet through the dense jungle, I came across a trail. It's fairly worn, and up ahead, I could hear the sounds of people talking. I walked for a few more feet, and then the jungle brush opened up, and it was like I beheld paradise or something. Imagine the most beautiful landscape. To my left was this waterfall. Water flowed down, creating this vast pool, and then that pool flowed down into a small river where people were everywhere. It felt like I had stumbled upon the most beautiful ecosystem known to man. I had never seen anything like this except on postcards. The locals even waved and were very friendly. Further down the river, I could see men panning for gold. This was amazing. I stood there looking up at this waterfall, awestruck by its intense beauty. Then it hit me. This is where we were going to bring heavy equipment and mine for gold? We're going to fucking destroy this place. At that point in time, I was conflicted and so deep in thought that I hadn't even realized that Dantes walked up behind me until he said, "Beautiful, isn't it? It's been this way since I was a little boy. But come now, we must prepare to go. This place we must leave now and get back to our camp. I have a long ride ahead of us and need to be away from here before dark." Dante stared attentively at the waterfall as he said this, and for a brief moment, I saw a look of concern on his face. But in those days, I was completely ignorant and naive to the dangers of the night. But looking back on that moment, if I knew then what I know now, I would have suspected something. We walked 300 feet or so back to the jungle to the area where we had parked the truck, hopped in and prepared to depart. But another strange sign was the workers. Now I understand these guys didn't have much of a choice. They were working for a drug cartel, so they did what they were told to do. But they had this look on their face. Not a look of fear, but a look of helplessness. Like they didn't want to stay there all night, but they had no choice. In reality, they didn't. And they stood there and watched us as we drove away with these blank looks on their faces. Almost like they were coming to terms with the fact that they were going to have to stay there the whole night. Although I was able to observe these things, I wouldn't understand the significance of it till the very next morning when we returned. When Dantes and I arrived back at the base camp, Rodger and Juan were sitting at a makeshift table eating what looked like chicken. However, something was off with Rodger. He had this look in his eyes. I had seen it before. It's not fear, but he looked uncomfortable. When he saw me walking up, he stood up from the table, smiled at Juan, and placed his hand on his shoulder walking by, and said, "I'll be back, my friend." And you have to understand something about Rodger. He and I have been together for a long time. His body language is very familiar to me. So familiar that I knew when he touched Juan on the shoulder, it was not meant to comfort Juan. It was a reminder to him that he needed to keep his wits about himself. Rodger was now manipulating Juan. Something had gone down. Something really important. Because he hadn't done this the prior night. We shook hands and returned to our hut. Once inside, Rodger closed the door, looked at me, and began to whisper, saying, "This motherfucker Juan is a goddamn psychopath." Listen, we flew into Colombia to get ammo and heavy weapons. He's going to kill every villager that's been mining the gold. I called Sorkin. He told me it's up to us how we handle it. He normally lets Juan make decisions, but we're in complete control right now. Now, Rodger was the wrong person to put in this situation. Long before the term bullying was a thing, Rodger hated people that abused power. And Juan was turning out to be the epitome of what he hated. What are we going to do, I asked. We're in the middle of the jungle, and it's his territory. It's his decision to make, Rodger. Sorkin is not here. We are. And I'm not taking a bullet in my ass over some fucking strangers, Rodger. Just then, we both heard a twig break outside the front door. Then a knock. It was Dante's. Steve, we must talk. Dante's had been told about Juan's plan and didn't like it either. He's not a man to kill innocent people. And looking back, at this moment in time, is when I learned how ruthless Rodger could be, given the right circumstances. See, there are different types of people in this world. But it all boils down to two things. People who sit back and watch things happen, and those who actually make them happen. Rodger went on to explain to Dante that Sorkin told him that we were now in charge and we were calling the shots. And then he started to try and brainwash Dantes, questioning him, saying, how long have you been working under Juan? Since you were in what, your 20s? What has that gotten you? How much longer do you think he'll keep you around? Dante surprised me when he looked at Rodger and said, there's no need for manipulation. I want to make a deal with you. I will kill Juan, but I want control of the drugs. You can have the gold. The villagers have to stay safe and they help us work the gold mine. We build roads, real houses, and get them electricity. If you can do that, I will kill Juan right now. Without hesitation, Rodger said yes. And although I had spent the whole day with Dantes, his disdain for Juan was something that I missed. Somehow Rodger saw it or picked up on it. I don't know, maybe Rodger picked up on something during the flight to Colombia, but he knew it. When Dantes walked out, I whispered, what if this is all a setup, a double cross to see if we're here to take over? That's when Rodger smiled, looked at me and said, it's not. Everyone wants to be the boss. Dantes now has his opportunity. He will take it, and he will take it fast. Besides, Steve, you don't understand. Juan is a major piece of shit. He's a pedophile. He talked about it the whole time we were in the plane. I damn near shot him myself. I took a deep breath, and as we walked out of the hut, the night air was so humid. No breeze. But this moment felt big. I mean colossal. This is the moment when we made the transition from two guys who traveled the world fucking off and stepped into the shrewd world of doing global business. And although the decision we made was to help the innocent people of the area, we had just initiated a hostile takeover, major drug operation. This all was a bit much for me, and I couldn't help but hold my head down as we walked out of the front door. Juan was still sitting at the table when we arrived. By now, he was half drunk. Dantes sat there quietly next to him as Rodger and I took a seat. Rodger squared his shoulders and smiled. Juan, you think we can talk about those villagers again in the morning? Maybe we can revisit the idea when you haven't been drinking. That's when Juan quickly stood to his feet, stumbling a bit and resting his hand on the table and said, Rodger, you are a boy. Sorkin told me, you play around the world with daddy's money, but have no money of your own. I'm a man. I built this drug operation myself. I'm a man, boy. Stay out of my way and let men do what they must do. A quick glance was all it took for Rodger to Dantes, and then the sound of a single gunshot echoed through the jungle. It's not like in the movies, you know, where the blood splatters all over the wall and a person just falls. Nah, Dantes shot him from a seated position. The bullet exploded his face. Juan's eyeball flew out on the table. He was able to turn and look at Dantes just before he fell to the ground. Half of his face was missing. I can only imagine how surprised he was when he realized that Dantes shot him. Beyond the eyeball sitting on the table and Juan's face literally being blown apart, what got me was how casual Dante was after he did it. Men came running with rifles, and upon discovering that Juan was dead, they smiled and laughed. He truly was a pedophile, molesting the children of the villagers. And Dantes was respected among the men as a fighter. He worked with them and toiled with them. He was one of them. And now he was in charge. This whole situation was a lot to process. It was my first time seeing a man get shot. I didn't want to show weakness, but I felt sick. The smell of blood was strong and his eyeball sitting on the table. Oh. I got up and walked away. Made it about 20 feet before I vomited. Rodger, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the events. He got up, shook Dante's hand, and walked into our hut. After I gathered myself, I walked in, wiping my mouth and said, "Did we do the right thing?" Rodger's reply was, "We did the only thing we could do. Now we have control of the situation and the respect of the people. Let's give it a few days. The word will spread and we'll be the heroes." Somehow, Rodger was able to go to sleep that night, but I wasn't. In my mind, I kept replaying Juan getting shot in the face over and over and over again. And the following morning, I was still awake when Dantes knocked on the door to our hut. "Wake up. It's time we go back. The men should be done by now." And when I walked out of the hut and past the table from last night, I could still smell the blood. Juan's body was gone, and in the distance there was smoke from a fire. I never took the time to ask, but it's safe to assume that they burned his body. Meanwhile, Dantes gathered 20 more men, weapons, fuel, lanterns, flashlights, all kinds of crap, and we headed out in a caravan towards the site. During the ride, I tried to tell Rodger about the beauty of this location, how majestic it was, and that we were going to destroy the place. But at that moment, Rodger had begun to transform into the man that he is today, cold-hearted and slightly disconnected. After an hour ride through the jungle, we arrived at the site where the men were supposed to be building huts, but no one was there. Only 3 huts had been built. No fires had been started. No food had been cooked. It was almost as if these guys disappeared. And Dante's reaction was pretty insightful. He seemed completely unsurprised by the situation. The rest of the men, they kneeled on the ground making the sign of the cross and began to pray. And they whispered among themselves this term. What was it? Los alados. Dantes instructed the men to look around for them and check the trees. "The trees?" Rodger said, looking at me. You see, we had no clue what we gotten ourselves into, but we would soon find out. Thinking that the men had just wandered off, Rodger and I proceeded to head towards the falls. We traveled the 300 feet or so to the trail, and when he first saw it, I think he realized what I was telling him. The village people were downriver at work, so we headed that way to talk to him. "How much gold can you find here in a day's time?" Rodger asked. "Would you like to make more?" The funny thing is, most Americans like us, we believe that people in third world countries are ignorant and uneducated. And in some cases, that's true. But in matters of money and value, these people knew exactly what they had. They just had no way of getting to more of it, and had no one to sell it to other than the drug cartels for food and clothes. I asked them if they knew what happened to the men that we left there yesterday, and it was weird. Prior to me asking that question, they were all smiles, then complete silence. The older men began to walk away, but standing right behind that group of older men was a teenage girl. She smiled and signaled for me to come over. That's when she told me she heard about Senor Juan, and it was good that he was gone. He had long been taking advantage of the girls in the area. This young girl was the first to explain to us the true danger of this beautiful paradise that we had found. She said that ever since she was 8 years old, no one in any of the villages would venture out at night. She said that everyone feared Los Alados, or the winged ones. These creatures would emerge from the caves behind the waterfalls at night. According to her, she had never seen one herself, but she heard that they were women with wings. Their eyes glowed this green color at night, and that they would take anyone outside near the falls at night. She said last night, they heard screams as soon as the sun went down, and that our men had probably been taken to the caves behind the falls. Rodger and I thought that this was complete bullshit. Legends that people tell kids to keep them out of the jungles at night. We figured it was a local's way of keeping their kids from being eaten by jaguars or bitten by snakes. However, the look on this girl's face was one of sheer terror, and she was afraid of something. We traveled back, finding Dante's and the rest of the men. They had begun to build these weird structures. They had dug holes in the ground and jammed logs into them. And on the opposite end, they had sharpened them to these very, very fine points. The best way to describe it is take your hands, spread your fingers, and point your palms to each other. Then with your hands straight, interlace your fingers between each other, making a triangle. Your fingertips will be where the logs were sharpened to these extremely sharp points. And that was the structures that we were going to stay in. While some of the men were at work, Dante has pulled us to the side and said, hey, we need to search the cave behind the waterfalls before dark. He said they found some of the men's torn and bloody clothing on a small cliff just before you reach the falls. What the teenage girl from the village said was starting to make sense. Rodger and I looked at each other like, what the fuck is going on? I said, hey, let's call Sorkin. So Rodger and I went to the Jeep, closed the doors, and placed the call. No answer. You think it's possible that something like that could be out there? Asked Rodger. All I could say is anything's possible, my friend. Based on all the evidence that was stacking up in front of us, indeed it looked like it was. Luckily for us, the pedophile Juan had got a mini arsenal, shotguns, AK-47s, flashlights, claymores, all kinds of crap. Back in those days, I had no idea how to use any of those weapons. Shit, I barely knew how to change a magazine on the AK-47. So I grabbed a shotgun and a flashlight. And Rodger took a 9mm sidearm and an AK-47. I'll never forget the day. 1345, May 5th. The day that would change our lives forever. Dante has gathered 12 men, accompanied by myself and Rodger. We ventured up into the area near the falls. Climbed to the cave, steep, wet, and very slippery. There was no way that our men had traveled this route in the dark. It was nearly impossible to do by daylight. So I began to question, how did the clothes actually end up there? When we reached the top, it was again some of the most beautiful scenery I had ever seen. The cave opening was straight ahead, leading into the rocks beyond the waterfall itself. Now the stench of death couldn't be detected outside of the cave. It was masked by the scent of fresh water cascading down. But upon entering the cave, my nose was assaulted by the smell of rotten meat, blood, and feces. A smell so strong that it made my eyes burn and my nose twitch. Dante bravely led the way deeper into this cave. And when we got about 50 feet in, it split into two different sections. One that sloped upward and to the left, and the other one straight ahead. Rodger and I, along with 3 men, went left, and Dante's took the rest of the men and went right. It didn't take us very long to realize that we weren't alone in these caves. We had this constant feeling of being watched. You know, like something was just in front of you in the darkness, and it was reaching out for you, toying with you, like it could get you at any moment. That's exactly how it felt, and I can't think of any other way of describing it. You knew you were in danger, and not in danger of a rock hitting you in the head. I'm talking about danger of something taking you and eating you. We had been moving forward through the darkness for about 20 minutes when the air suddenly became fresh. It was this draft blowing, and steps ahead of us in the cave, and a few steps ahead, the cave opened up into this huge cavern. Our lights barely penetrated the darkness, and when Rodger lit a flare, the place was massive. When I looked down, we were walking towards the end of a ledge. It dropped straight down. If we had taken just another 20 steps, we'd have all died. At that point, we hadn't heard anything out of the normal. Just the sounds of water dripping and the echo of our own footsteps. But when one of the men lit a flare and tossed it over the edge, something happened. We started to hear this noise, kind of screeching and crackling at first, then flapping of wings. Now this was no hallucination. These sounds were real. They were coming from above us and below us. I shined the flashlight upwards trying to see what it was, and that's when I caught a glimpse of what looked like a giant wing. By giant, I mean leathery and long, 7 feet I would guess. Gotta go back. I began to pull Rodger as I slid past the other 2 guys, trying to get back into the tunnel. I was pulling Rodger so hard that the shirt began to rip, and when I looked back, that was the first time I saw one of them. Imagine a naked woman with wings. I had turned around just in time to witness this creature knock one of the men off the ledge. Then the other guys came running towards us as Rodger and I began to panic, rushing through the darkness of the tunnel. I dropped my weapon. Fear had completely taken over me. I struggled to breathe. And as we ran, I began to hear gunfire and screams. After about 10 minutes of stumbling around in the darkness, I could finally see the light and begin to hear the sounds of the waterfalls. When we got to the entrance of the cave, there was no sign of Dante and his men. Luckily, one of the other men who was with us, a man named Alejandro, found a shell casing on the floor near the entrance. He told us that he believed that they had left us behind and we needed to go outside. And when we emerged from the cave, Alejandro was right. I could see Dante and another man quickly heading towards the bottom of the falls. "What the fuck was that?" said Rodger. And Alejandro, with this cryptic voice, says, "Those were the winged ones. And now that we disturbed them, they will come for us all." We rushed down the side of the falls, and when we got back to camp, Dantes was frantically moving around barking orders. He had already called 75 more men from his operation to come to this camp, and it took about 30 minutes to get him to explain to us what happened. Dante said that they found themselves at the bottom of the same cavern that we were in, that he saw the flare we tossed down falling from the air, and the floor was riddled with carcasses of dead animals. But it wasn't until they found the dead bodies of the missing men that they really began to panic. These men, their chests and stomachs had been ripped open. Their hearts, lungs, and organs were all gone. Then they heard the wings and the screeching. Dante says that when he turned to lead them out, a winged woman was standing right behind one of his men. She engulfed him with her wings, and he heard his bones crackling. He saw the blood leaking from his body. That's when he all opened fire. One by one, his men were killed or just taken and flown off into the darkness. That's when he ran. Only him and one other man escaped. We were dealing with something that Rodger and I had not anticipated. But naked women with wings? And on top of that, we only had a few hours till sundown. I went and sat down inside our hut just trying to clear my head. But there was this constant movement and panic outside. And when the rest of the men arrived, they came with generators and lights. Rodger and I didn't say much to each other in the hours leading up to sundown. We knew if we wanted to maintain control of this mine, we'd have to stand with Dantes and his men and deal with whatever came that night. So when the sun began to go down, Rodger and I stood among the men and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then at 10 p.m., the treetops began to sway and move, but there was no breeze blowing. There had been none the entire day. Then it sounded just like thunder. Everywhere you looked were these creatures. Their eyes glowed these green colors from the lights. The men began to fire randomly as the winged ones swooped down from the sky. I was standing right next to Rodger when one of them flew over us. Massive wings, and without any effort, it bludgeoned one of the men in the head. Upon witnessing this, the situation became so real to me that I began to open fire myself. These creatures weren't invincible. In fact, shooting their wings sent them crashing to the ground. This fight went on through the entire night, and when the sun rose and we did a head count, we were down 22 men. And there were 15 dead creatures. And when Rodger and I finally got a chance to take a closer look, they looked just like women. I mean, every female feature was exactly the same. The skin was pale though, and it turned red in the sunlight, as if they were getting severe sunburn. I would have expected them to have sharp teeth like some kind of vampires from a movie, but they didn't. They had one row of teeth. But when we measured these things, this tallest one would have stood 10 feet tall, and the smaller ones 7 feet, and their wingspans ranged from 12 to 19 feet. Dantes rounded up the bodies and burned them, then sent men into the caves with explosives to seal off the entrances. The following day, we were finally able to get Sorkin on the phone. We told him about these creatures and how we had to kill them to secure the location. That's when Sorkin said, "Oh yes, Los Alados, the women of the caves. If you took care of them, then we have a secure location." Fuck. Sorkin knew about these creatures. Not only did he know about them, he knew they were there the whole time. I didn't know whether to feel played or pissed. He used us. Rodger began to negotiate with Sorkin. He told him, "We secured the land, killed the monsters, and now we want 35% of all the revenues. If not, we'll just buy and move the equipment in here ourselves and keep 100%. And he told Sorkin, "You can consider the 32% a bonus for almost getting us killed." By the end of the day, they had agreed to 22%. And Rodger cut a custodial deal with Dantes for 2%, just so he can keep an eye on the place and make sure the winged ones didn't come back. After that, we left and returned to the States. So now you know how we got started in this life of hunting monsters. But it's absolutely nothing like what you see on TV. Sometimes I wish it was. I can assure you that reality is far worse than fiction.